Dr. Elif Guler, an assistant professor of rhetoric and professional writing at Longwood University in Farmville, Virginia. An article I co-authored with Dr. Iklim Goksel, who is an ethnographer currently living in Alaska, will appear in the fall 2017 issue of Reflections. The editors of Reflections wanted me to talk about how this project came about. Our article was completed based on a study I conducted in an advanced rhetoric and professional writing course at my institution, a 4-year liberal arts college. The study was inspired by ideas on the public work of rhetorical instruction. We argue that this work includes helping students develop as global citizens, and this is possible by allowing students to explore and critically become aware of various national cultures and the rhetorical traditions across the world. Instructional activities that build on cross-national texts enable the writing classroom to function as a microcosm of larger contexts where public rhetorics are practiced. The study is also a stance against an understanding of rhetoric as essentially a Western phenomenon based on the classical Greco-Roman tradition. Dr. Goksel and I are international scholars, both introduced to written communication practices in the Turkish context. A few years ago, we started talking about how we can integrate our expertise in Turkish rhetorical tradition into our pedagogical practices here in the US. So our study employed rhetoric as a practice of public speaking and written composition in a non-Western national culture. An influential example of oratory in the Turkish context is Turkey's founding father Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's address to the youth, which we referenced in our study as the address. This text constitutes the final statement of Atatürk's Nutuk, roughly translated as the Great Speech, delivered in 1927. Atatürk is known as the revolutionary founder and the first president of the modern Turkish Republic, following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. He delivered Nutuk to the Turkish parliament for an unconventional duration of 36 hours over 6 days. The Great Speech provides Atatürk's account of the Turkish War of Independence fought after the World War I and Turkey's transition from an empire to a modern nation-state. In the conclusion of the Great Speech, Atatürk addresses the Turkish youth, instructing them to take civic action when they face adversity. The address represents an anti-colonial resistance rhetoric and aims to introduce civic consciousness to citizens within the political realm of a newly founded nation-state. So we decided to use the address as a non-Western pedagogical tool to rethink the public work of rhetorical instruction. I presented the address to the students in one of my rhetoric classes as a form of public rhetoric to encourage students' engagement with cross-national cultures. So the essay entitled The Pedagogical Implications for Teaching Atatürk's Address to the Youth for Global Public Rhetorics and Civic Action in the US Writing Classroom presents the practical and actual processes of integrating non-Western texts into our writing pedagogy and rhetorical instruction. The study has 2 parts. In the first part, student groups analyzed an English translation of the address. We found that the particular way students engaged with this cross-national text highlights the rhetorical nature of writing that is essential to civic action, which deserves attention, particularly in the globalizing contemporary world. Because of their lack of familiarity with the cultural context of the text, students experienced challenges engaging with the text. This is a dilemma, however, that helps students come to terms with contextual knowledge constraints of a rhetorical situation, as well as the affordances of such situations for making meaning out of text. And students urged to solve the rhetorical puzzle of a non-Western text, with virtually little to no knowledge of its historical context, provided the students even the previously disengaged ones, with a new purpose of discovery in a rhetoric and writing course. When students' uneasiness turned into a purpose-driven openness to analyzing and understanding the non-Western text, some of the students' findings indicated that in their analysis they tended to revert back to their earlier knowledge of classical Aristotelian rhetorical concepts. For example, when students focused on Atatürk's use of pathos or emotional appeals, such as invoking a fear of the enemy or giving hope through a promise of the future. However, the address also attributes knowledge of history as essential for one's national existence, and students were able to recognize this principle as a requisite for rhetorical agency in the Turkish context. Another rhetorical feature the students recognized based on an earlier frame of reference was the text's omission of religious discourse in favor of promoting national sentiment. Students noticed that this rhetorical model posed a radical shift from the rhetorical and contextual choices students had previously studied in other texts, such as in Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, where appeals to religious sentiments were repeatedly made. Students were also able to observe through the address, for example, the ways in which the notions of patriotism and sense of pride for one's country are rhetorically expressed in another national culture. In our observations, we try to stay away from trying to understand and interpret non-Western rhetorical practices through a Greco-Roman lens. It's helpful to consider rhetoric as a practice, but not as a systematic study of discipline in non-Western contexts, including the Turkish case. Once the students were encouraged to share any observations made in the address without a rhetorical frame of reference, the students were able to recognize additional elements that could be attributed to the address, such as the notion of social responsibility as essential for rhetorical action, which is evident in Atatürk's characterization of civic action as citizens' first duty. Students were able to see this in forms that are unique to the Turkish case, and yet the students could not fully point out why or how these forms were different due to their ongoing contextual struggles. In our class exploration of non-Western rhetorics, this made the students pay further attention to the conditions and contexts in which non-Western rhetorics were practiced, which in and of itself served as a learning outcome and was later to be enhanced upon providing the students with more historical context. The second part of our application aimed to prompt students to think about how the rhetorical strategies in a non-Western text can function at a local level in debating an issue that can be personally relevant to many of them. Using the same discourse strategies of the address, students compose texts to protest problems that they face in the contemporary educational context of the US, such as high cost of education. Introducing an anti-colonial text that was written in a non-Western context presented the students with a new set of rhetorical conventions. The text prompted students' thinking in such a way that it allowed them to bring out their own rhetorical abilities. The new language they learned from the non-Western text challenged the students to write outside of the rhetorical conventions they were used to and allowed them to mobilize a new discourse for inquiry and public action necessary for a critical citizenship. So our essay reporting on this study focused on the pedagogical implications of teaching a non-Western text for a more inclusive and diverse understanding of global rhetorics in the US writing classroom. Overall, we believe contextually influential cross-national texts can provide guidance for instructors in a systematic introduction of rhetorics for civic action and change. I thank Reflections editors for acknowledging studies with a global rhetorical focus and inviting us to take part in its community of scholars.